Taxes. Taxes are certainly higher. A federal income tax of 35 to 40% is something many middle-class Americans must pay, while on average they work for the government more than half the year. In passing on our estates from one generation to the next, our partner, the U.S. government, decides on its share before the next generation can take over. The estate tax certainly verifies the saying about the inevitability of death and taxes. At the turn of the century, we had neither, and in spite of a continuous outcry against both, there's no sign that either will soon be eliminated. Accepting the principle behind both the income and the estate tax concedes the statist notion that the government owns the fruits of our labor as well as our savings, and we are permitted by the politicians' generosity to keep a certain percentage. Every tax cut proposal in Washington now is considered a cost to government, not the return of something rightfully belonging to a productive citizen. This principle is true whether it's a 1% or a 70% income tax. Concern for this principle has been rarely expressed in a serious manner over the past 50 years. The withholding process has permitted many to believe that a tax rebate at the end of the year comes as a gift from government. Because of this, the real cost of government to the taxpayer is obscured. The income tax has grown to such an extent, and the government is so dependent on it, that any talk of eliminating the income tax is just that, talk. A casual acceptance of the principle behind high taxation with an income tax and an inheritance tax is incompatible with a principled belief in a true republic. It is impossible to maintain a high tax system without the sacrifice of liberty and an undermining of property ownership. If kept in place, such a system will undermine prosperity regardless of how well off we may presently be. In truth, the amount of taxes we now pay compared to 100 years ago is shocking. There is little philosophic condemnation by the intellectual community, the political leaders, or the media of this immoral system. This should be a warning sign to all of us that even in less prosperous times, we can expect high taxes and that our productive economic system will come under attack. Not only have we seen little resistance to the current high tax system, it has become an acceptable notion that this system is moral and is a justified requirement to finance the welfare warfare state. Propaganda polls are continuously cited, claiming that the American people don't want tax reductions. High taxes, except for only short periods of time, are incompatible with liberty and prosperity. We will, I'm sure, be given the opportunity in the early part of the next century to make a choice between the two. I am certain of my preference. Welfare. There was no welfare state in 1900. In the year 2000, we have a huge welfare state, which continues to grow each year. Not that special interest legislation didn't exist in the 19th century, but for the most part, it was limited and directed toward the moneyed interest, the most egregious example being the railroads. The modern-day welfare state has steadily grown since the Great Depression of the 1930s. The federal government is now involved in providing health care, houses, unemployment benefits, education, food stamps to millions, plus all kinds of subsidies to every conceivable special interest group. Welfare is now part of our culture, costing hundreds of billions of dollars every year. It is now thought to be a right, something one is entitled to. Calling it an entitlement makes it sound proper and respectable and not based on theft. Anyone who has a need, desire, or demand and can get the politician's attention will get what he wants, even though it may be at the expense of someone else. Today, it is considered morally right and politically correct to promote the welfare state. Any suggestion otherwise is considered political suicide. The acceptance of the welfare ethic and rejection of the work ethic as the accepted process for improving one's economic conditions are now ingrained in our political institutions. This process was started in earnest in the 1930s, received a big boost in the 1960s, and has continued a steady growth even through the 1990s, despite some rhetoric in opposition. This public acceptance has occurred in spite of the fact that there is no evidence that welfare is a true help in assisting the needy. Its abject failure around the world, where welfarism took the next step into socialism, has even a worse record. The transition in the past 100 years from essentially no welfare to an all-encompassing welfare state represents a major change in attitude in the United States. Along with this acceptance, the promoters have dramatically reinterpreted the Constitution from the way it had been for our first 150 years. Where the General Welfare Clause once had a clear general meaning, which was intended to prohibit special interest welfare and was something they detested and revolted against under the King George, it is now used to justify any demand of any group as long as a majority in the Congress votes for it. But the history is clear, and the words in the Constitution are precise. Madison and Jefferson, in explaining the General Welfare Clause, left no doubt as to its meaning. Madison said, quote, "With respect to the words general welfare, I have always regarded them as qualified by the detail of power connected with them. To take them in a literal and unlimited sense would be a metamorphosis of the Constitution into a character which there is a host of proof not contemplated by its creators," close quote. Madison argued that there would be no purpose whatsoever for the enumeration of the particular powers if the General Welfare Clause was to be broadly interpreted. The Constitution granted authority to the federal government to do only 20 things, each to be carried out for the benefit of the general welfare of all the people. This understanding of the Constitution, as described by the father of the Constitution, has been lost in this century. Jefferson was just as clear, writing in 1798 when he said, quote, "Congress has not unlimited powers to provide for the general welfare, but only those specifically enumerated." With the modern-day interpretation of the General Welfare Clause, the principle of individual liberty and the doctrine of enumerated powers have been made meaningless. The goal of strictly limiting the power of our national government, as was intended by the Constitution, is impossible to achieve as long as it is acceptable for Congress to redistribute wealth in an egalitarian welfare state. There's no way that personal liberty will not suffer with every effort to expand or make the welfare state efficient. And the sad part is that the sincere effort to help people do better economically through welfare programs always fails. Dependency replaces self-reliance, while the sense of self-worth of the recipient suffers, making for an angry, unhappy, and dissatisfied society. The cost in dollar terms is high, but the cost in terms of liberty is even greater, but generally ignored. And in the long run, there's nothing to show for this sacrifice. Today, there's no serious effort to challenge welfare as a way of life, and its uncontrolled growth in the next economic downturn is to be expected. Too many citizens now believe they're entitled to the monetary assistance from the government anytime they need it, and they expect it. Even in times of plenty, the direction has been to continue expanding education, welfare, and retirement benefits. No one asks where the government gets the money to finance the welfare state. Is it morally right to do so? Is it authorized in the Constitution? Does it help anyone in the long run? Who suffers from the policy? Until these questions are seriously asked and correctly answered, we cannot expect the march toward a pervasive welfare state to stop, and we can expect our liberties to be continuously compromised. The concept of the doctrine of enumerated powers was picked away at in the latter part of the 19th century over strong objection by many constitutionalists. But it was not until the drumbeat of fear coming from the Roosevelt administration during the Great Depression that the courts virtually rewrote the Constitution by reinterpretation of the General Welfare Clause. In 1936, the New Deal Supreme Court told Congress and the American people that the Constitution is irrelevant when it comes to limits being placed on congressional spending. In a ruling justifying the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the court pronounced, quote, "The power of Congress to authorize appropriations of public money for public purposes is not limited by the grants of legislative power found in the Constitution," close quote. With the stroke of a pen, the courts amended the Constitution in such a sweeping manner that it literally legalized the entire welfare state, which, not surprisingly, has grown by leaps and bounds ever since. Since this ruling, we have rarely heard the true explanation of the General Welfare Clause as being a restriction of government power, not a grant of unlimited power. We cannot ignore corporate welfare, which is part of the problem. Most people think the welfare state involves only giving something to the unfortunate poor. This is generally true, but once the principle established that special benefits are legitimate, the moneyed interests see the advantages in influences the legislative process. Our system, which pays lip service to free enterprise and private property ownership, is drifting toward a form of fascism or corporatism rather than conventional socialism. And where the poor never seem to benefit under welfare, corporations become richer. But it should have been expected that once the principle of favoritism was established, the contest would be over who has the greatest clout in Washington. No wonder lobbyists are willing to spend $125 million per month influencing Congress. It's a good investment. No amount of campaign finance reform or regulation of lobbyists can deal with this problem. The problem lies in the now accepted role for our government. Government has too much control over people and the market, making the temptation and incentive to influence government irresistible and to a degree necessary. Curtailing how people spend their own money or their right to petition their government will do nothing to help this influence peddling. Treating the symptoms and not the disease only further undermines the principles of freedom and property ownership. Any serious reforms or effort to break away from the welfare state must be directed as much at corporate welfare as routine welfare. Since there's no serious effort to reject welfare on principle, the real conflict over how to divide what government plunders will continue. Once it's clear that the nation is not nearly as wealthy as it appears, this will become a serious problem, and it will get the attention it deserves, even here in the Congress. Preserving liberty and restoring constitutional precepts are impossible as long as the welfare mentality prevails, and that will not likely change until we've run out of money. But it will become clear as we move into the next century that perpetual wealth and the so-called balanced budget, along with an expanding welfare state, cannot continue indefinitely. Any effort to perpetuate it will only occur with the further erosion of liberty.